Thank you all for being here. I've got two kind of quick housekeeping items. The first is I was raised by a woman who grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, and she always told me when you go to somebody's house, you say thank you. So I have to start my remarks from a position of gratitude. Thank you to Columbia Business School for having us. My partner in creativity, Nan Gibson, I think when we kind of launched the coalition, this is something we probably never thought would happen so quickly. So thank you to Columbia for hosting us. The second thing I just want to make sure that we give the team here is two companion pieces that I recommend that you read in addition to the remarks that you've already heard today and the remarks that you're going to hear shortly. The first is Providing Another Chance, which is produced by RAND Corporation. It's a 2022 study. I encourage you to read it. And the second publication I encourage folks to read is Untapped Talent. It's a book that was published by author was Jeff Korzenik. It was published in 2021. Those are two good resources to look at if you just want to have a little bit more context and a little bit more of the numbers and the science that supports everything that we've discussed today. What we're going to do here with this panel is we're going to have a really kind of a tactical conversation that's split into three parts. The first part is looking at second chance hiring practices from the employer perspective. The second thing that we're going to do is look at, what's the candidate experience like and how can we improve that experience? And the last thing that we'll touch on is, what does success look like? What is the indicia of success that it's actually working within an organization? So Carrie, I'm going to come to you first. And for those of you who are not familiar with Carrie, she is the Senior Director and Global Head of University Recruiting, as well as Talent Branding and Diversity Recruiting for PayPal. So she has a lot to do and a lot of responsibilities. But for today's conversation, I want to hear a little bit about, what is PayPal's view on second chance hiring?
Yeah. So, hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. Hope you enjoyed your lunch. I think, this is newer for us, to be very transparent. So what you're going to hear from me today is a real reaction of what we've been going through and experiencing as we launch something new. And what we see is that, today, our hiring needs for skilled talent are increasing every year. And the complication is that unemployment rates are low and job vacancy rates are high. So how do we take this situation and really address our hiring needs? And so we've taken it as an opportunity to really rethink our hiring strategies and our approach. And in particular, trying to think about how we can find unknown talent in often overlooked populations, such as individuals with criminal backgrounds. And so that's really how we got into this. We've been working on this for the last year and a half. We have definitely had a lot of learnings across the way, which we can talk about later. But one of the things that I think we've seen is that I think we all believe that redemption after incarceration is possible. But convictions serve as barriers to reentry oftentimes, where people cannot find full-time, well-paying job opportunities. And then these barriers impact their ability to re-enter the workforce. And at the same time, this impacts corporations who are trying to hire individuals. So the barriers keep, adding up. And then these companies can't prioritize financial health for their community, and they cannot participate in the global economy. And so for PayPal, that's one of our key priorities. And so this really hits home for us and is part of our value and part of our mission. And we understand that our mission to advance economic opportunity starts within. And so we are continually rolling out programs so that we can bolster financial health in the economy. But all of this then trickles into the talent acquisition process. So how can we make sure that we're offering competitive pay and benefits to everybody? And we'll talk a little bit later about what we've seen with some programs where when we're working with formerly incarcerated individuals, there seems to be almost this option of a different pay scale. A job is a job. And we believe in paying somebody for the work they're going to be doing, regardless of where they're coming from. So a lot of the things that we've seen have really hit home in terms of just trying to discern our own moral compass and how we address this topic and how we roll it out.
And you mentioned programs. Are you partnering with organizations that are outside of PayPal to kind of implement your programs?
Yeah. So we have engaged in a partnership with an organization called Next Chapter. I don't know if anyone is familiar with Next Chapter, but they work with formerly incarcerated individuals to try to help them get back into the workforce. And we selected this partnership after many discussions with lots of different other organizations. We selected Next Chapter because they really were closely aligned with our own mission and our priority focus on inclusion. So for that reason, we really selected this organization. They have a very rigorous process, and I actually have notes on it because I'm not sure I'm going to get it right, but I'm going to try. So this organization works with folks who have a criminal background. These individuals who want to participate in Next Chapter have to go through a year of coding or formal training, and then they apply to participate in the program. So they have an application process, they have an interview process, and then they have a technical screening. From there, they go through a very rigorous 12-week immersive experience with Hack Reactor Bootcamp. And then I say if successful because it's a very hard process, it's a very challenging process, and there is a dropout rate along the way. And so if successful, then participants are matched with a partner organization and they participate in a 12-week apprenticeship program. So we are now engaging in our first cohort of apprentices. They'll be joining us in July, and we're gonna be taking active notes along the way so that we can pivot in the moment, see what's working well, what's not working well, to ensure the success for both the individual and for PayPal, and really understand how we can grow this. So we're starting small so that we can make sure that this is working and it's working well.
A lot of sense. Pat, I want to bring you into the conversation. I'm a little too familiar with Jackson Lewis, but just to level set with the rest of the team here, can you talk a little bit about who is Jackson Lewis, what do you all specialize in, and kind of your reach from a geographic perspective?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Dan. My name is Pat Peters, and I'm a principal with Jackson Lewis in our Cleveland office. We started here in New York City about almost, I think it was 65 years ago Sunday. And we mostly did labor relations and union avoidance and then how to work with unions. But then over time, as the Civil Rights Act was amended and other laws came into play with respect to workplace compliance, we've grown both in terms of subspecialties as well as geography. Cleveland, when it opened in 2006, was the 25th office, 400th lawyer. Today we have about 1,000 lawyers spread across about 60 offices in the United States. And some of us hyper-specialize in certain things, including my colleague Susan Corcoran, who's here today, who is one of our firm's nationwide background check resources. So in addition to helping employers, if they to manage their workforce, we counsel them on these types of decisions. I notice a lot of buzzwords that we heard about paying for the job, not having a penalty. So we do a lot of pay equity compliance. But so it's a lot of compliance work, and then we try to keep employers out of litigation. But when the inevitable happens, we defend employers in those cases as well.
Thank you for your services on that. So what I want to talk to you about here in this case is when employers like the PayPals of the world or the Eatons of the world, and they call you and say, hey, somebody's got this plan that they want to increase our second chance hiring. I would imagine some of those are frantic phone calls from HR professionals and lawyers inside the organization. How do you go about correcting the myths that they have associated with second chance hiring?
So first of all, I think there's three big, when we're thinking about second chance hiring and thinking about changing the way some of your company hiring practices, our top three things, and I think you've heard them already throughout today, but it bears repeating, is remove the box. Right. Number one, and I saw the video that was very impactful early on with all kinds of different people and looking at that application, they're so excited. You can see the excitement in their face, right, that they wanted this opportunity and this job, and they get to that question, right? So get rid of the box, right? And in fact, in many jurisdictions, not nationwide, but in many jurisdictions, you have to. So you might as well get rid of it if you're a multi-state employer, rather than have a different application for one state versus another. They are becoming more, there are more and more ban-the-box laws enacted, and so we're seeing that would be the number one suggestion. Number two is only do a background check after you've made the offer. So that way you're not factoring in any type of justice involvement in making that decision. You've decided you like the candidate, you decided to make the offer, offer, do the background check, and there may very well be a reason not to go forward with the employment, but at least at that stage, you're not, you can't be accused of discriminating against somebody in terms of actually making that initial decision. And then finally, I think the third main thing we'd encourage employers to do is consider there's a lot of local laws. And in states like New York and states like California, you don't just have to comply with New York federal law, New York state law, New York City law. In California, I know Los Angeles has their own law. So make sure that you're engaged with somebody who's got expertise, hopefully from Jackson Lewis, but if not, somewhere else in those particular areas. But how do you get employers comfortable is talking to them about, where the law kind of stands and why, there should be this flexibility when it comes to justice involvement. For many years, the easy thing to do, and as a lawyer, the last thing I want to be is a roadblock, right? So if a client calls me up and says, can we do this? The answer it can't be no. Right? The answer has to be, we're going to figure out a way to work together and get you there. And when it comes to this particular issue, the way we get companies comfortable is educating them on, making sure that any kind of barrier to employment is job-related, consistent with business necessity. Sometimes those things are absolute barriers. There are certain industries, financial services, for example, where there are certain crimes, unfortunately, that are just statutory bars to employment, right? But a lot of times there's a measure of discretion that the employer can exercise. And so we look at, how old was this person when they had the conviction? How, are there any other mitigating factors? How much time has passed, right? And so I think going through that analysis and going through that process helps employers get comfortable that they're doing the diligence to protect the company, but also giving that candidate that opportunity. And one other thing that was very impactful to me today is some of these convictions that we're hearing about today wouldn't even be crimes. Like we hear about folks, especially in the cannabis industry, and I was just telling Stan, I was visiting Las Vegas a couple weeks ago, and like you walk into the mall, and it's like, they're handing out, recreational marijuana as samples, right? And there's folks who that's their conviction because the law has changed so quickly over time. So I think as societal norms change, as the laws evolve, it is a very fluid process. And so I think getting comfortable means you have to kind of step out of your comfort zone a little bit, because the easy thing to do is just say no, right? We don't hire anybody with criminal convictions, and then there's no harm, no foul, no worry, right? But over time, that's not going to be a sustainable position, both in terms of the law and also in terms of the labor market. So you got to get comfortable, and it's going to take some work, and we're happy to partner with you to do that.
And one thing I want to follow up with you on is, I would imagine a lot of times when folks are reaching out to you, they don't ask you the clean legal question. They don't say, hey, what does the EOC have to say about this? They'll frame it up as, I want to make sure my workplace is safe.
Right.
I'm concerned about safety. How do you go about addressing a type of question like that? Well, it's really not a legal question. It's a lot of bias that's embedded in it, and you're working against it to show the data and the facts. Like, how are you addressing it when that type of question comes?
So I think, a lot of times, when I think about employment law, due process, which for those of you who are not lawyers, basically means, notice and an opportunity to be heard. In other words, it's fairness, right? And I think that to Stan's point, one thing that I'm always cautioning employers, whether it's this issue or any other, is how are we treating anyone else, right? And would this be first of all, maybe someone self-disclosed, right? Or maybe, have we treated someone differently in the past? Would we treat someone differently in the future, but for this particular issue? And I think helping to isolate that bias, to your point, I think does help employers get more comfortable. And the other thing that I'll tell you, a lot of times who we're dealing with on our end is someone who is maybe even at like a director level. And I think it's part of the diligence. I think they want to document that, I called Pat, we talked through it, I'm comfortable, right? So that way, they're still putting their neck out a little bit, but not they're not going it alone. And we're having that interactive discussion, having that dialogue, really thinking about all those factors that may mitigate against barring employment.
Sense. Matt, Envoy. Can you tell the crowd a little bit about what Envoy does?
Yeah, I was going to say we do a little bit of what Pat does without a legal degree. So we work with large companies on
The
implementation.
unauthorized practice of law? Is that? Got it.
Don't describe it that way, but really we do implementation support. So we work with companies who want to create second chance initiatives, who want to create the culture inside their company to do this, and who want to go through the process of how do we update our practices, how do we create partnerships, how do we create pilots to sort of lead in this work, and then how do we do the training and the sort of support to our staff, to our implementers, to supervisors and HR managers to make sure we're doing this right and doing this well and making fair chance a part of our talent strategy and a big piece of what we do.
I had to challenge you a little bit on your just business model in general. With larger corporations have large HR teams, they have significant legal teams. Why would a large corporation need to have a partnership with a community-based organization to implement this type of strategy? Why do they need that?
So, yeah, I mean, I would start where Pat left off, which I think the first thing companies do is they decide we're going to make a commitment to do this, right? This is something that we care about, our CEO cares about, our team cares about. And then I think there is a process first of what do we need to do to get our house right, to make sure we can match our goals with the policies that we have. And I do think as dynamic as what Pat described is a lot of companies haven't revisited HR practices since the 90s, right? And so they may start from a place where, we did it one way for a long time. We may have made changes on the margins since then, but to do the thing that we're setting out to do in this new environment, we need to go back and do a little remedial work. So I think that's a starting point for a lot of companies is just what do we need to look at in terms of things like ban the box, in terms of our hiring matrix, in terms of just the way in which we do individual assessment of candidates to make sure that, again, we're sort of matching up. And then I think the community partnerships piece to us is kind of the crux of where a lot of companies find success in this work. Because I think first and foremost, it creates real world practices that you can learn from. So a lot of companies will say, well, let's start this in maybe one business unit or one market, a place where we have an awesome leader at this company who wants to do this work, and where we can find great reentry organizations, great workforce organizations that can become our talent pipeline, that can help us vet candidates, that can work with us on what does sort of an interview process and cadence look like, perhaps train us on how to do that right. And then I think equally importantly, make sure that we're supporting those candidates post-hire. So I think one of the big differences in the kind of community organization that will say, here's a stack of resumes of great candidates, go to work, versus one that's going to be a long-term partner is, are they with you and are they with that candidate, in the first month where maybe something is challenging, right? Maybe the company's trying to figure out how do we deal with parole supervision? How do we deal with someone's unstable housing? And so I think those partnerships, to be able to start with a really strong partnership, create a model that the rest of the company can learn from, and then have that model be kind of extrapolated throughout the company is the way we see a lot of companies succeeding.
And what should you look for in a partner?
So yeah, I think first and foremost, it's are they aligned in terms of the readiness and the support that candidates are getting when they come in. So I think some of the great reentry organizations are starting folks, whether they're a day out of jail or prison or whether they've been out for some time, starting folks with basics of interviewing skills, workforce readiness, make sure that folks are going into these opportunities as prepared as possible. I think the second thing is that pre-vetting. And I think we heard this a bit in the ARC and NBC Universal relationship, that to the extent that the partner can really know the company well enough to say, here are the candidates that have the skills and qualifications you're looking for, that have, if you have some convictions that, are going to require a long review process, some convictions that, that you're fine with, that's communicated well enough that the community organization is referring candidates that have a high likelihood of success. And I think that communication is probably the most important thing, because I think you find as a community partner refers, the first 10 candidates, if none of them get through the process, it's going to be a really hard relationship from there, right? And I think the community organization is going to say, is this the right partnership? Whereas if you've done the pre-work and the relationship building, hopefully you're going to have some success early on.
Carrie, before we move on to kind of the next bucket of this conversation, I want to come back to you and kind of summarize what's been discussed thus far. As we think about the employer perspective, I think you'd agree with me that it's kind of split into three parts. The first is the corporation has to make a decision that they want to prioritize recruiting and hiring in this space. The second thing is to really look at their internal policies. What is written down? What do we do? How do we do this work? Yeah. And then lastly is the implementation of an actual strategy in a specific geographic region to create the sustainable pipeline, have the community-based organizations. So I see the head nodding, which lets me know.
Yes, and on that last
Yeah.
button, I would just say over the lifetime of the employee, not just when they arrive. So you really need to partner long-term, and that's a commitment that has to be made upfront. If we can't make that commitment, I just don't think it will work.
That makes a lot of sense. And so the one thing that I wanted to circle back with you on is, I think corporations have the tendency of, let me do as much as I can inside the four walls of my corporation before I bring anybody else in to look under the tent. As you've thought about PayPal's strategy and the lessons learned from what you have done,
Yep.
would you have brought in a community-based organization or a partner like Matt from the very beginning? Or would you still have waited until you kind of
I'd
cleaned your
love to
house
have more
first?
conversations. I'm loving this conversation. I will say it's illustrative of the past year and a half to 2 years at PayPal, where we have partnered heavily internally. And I heard Dane mention this before, it cannot fall on HR. And so we've been working with compliance, with corporate affairs, with HR, with legal, and we have these rich discussions. And everyone is all in. Everyone is completely invested. And so I do think that that is a critical piece, is trying to think about how you can, and I also think there's something else, which is one, it's this internal partnership, and two is, and it's not just with this audience, I think an employer's obligation to every employee is to meet someone where they are. And so whether that means it's someone joining from Next Chapter for PayPal, or somebody joining from a university, or someone joining from a lateral move, everyone has different needs. And so this cookie cutter approach just does not cut it anymore. It really doesn't work. And so this rich discussion that we've been having right now is very, I think that's what you have to have up front. And so to answer your question, yes, I think it probably would have been helpful. I do think that PayPal was fostering this exact same dialogue. You both hit on things that we talk about over and over every single week. And I think a really important thing to think about is not just, so many organizations are quick to say, oh, we need to do this. And they sign up for something, and then they make a very public appeal about what they're doing. But how does it get over the finish line? And so the question to start with is, what will it take to get this to be successful? Not how do we launch this, not how do we do this, but what's it going to take to make sure this is successful? And really embracing that mindset and knowing when to pivot, right? Because the best laid plans are not right. They're well-intentioned, but this is uncharted territory. And I can tell you at PayPal, we have dropped the agenda multiple times and we've pivoted because we needed to. And I find that rewarding. It tells me that we're not using a cookie cutter approach and that we are understanding what we're dealing with and trying to accommodate things in a very different and unique manner. So I do think the partnership would be helpful. And if anyone is considering a program like this, honestly, call any one of us and engage us in the conversation, particularly these two, because you're more experts, but I'm happy to share my experience as well.
I think just to piggyback on that, I think while we don't want to have a cookie cutter approach, we definitely want to take the time to build the program and then drive consistency. And I think the
Yes.
one thing I'd be remiss in not pointing out is training. And that's where I think a lot of companies or large organizations struggle, is the intent is there, the idea, the concept is there, but the person actually making the decisions isn't trained. And so you get varying degrees of success at different parts of the organization. So I think training is huge, and that obviously is a commitment of time, money, resources, the whole thing. So it's definitely something that should be factored in. But I think to your point, having these robust discussions and considering all the alternatives and pivoting and starting and restarting, I think is very important. And then implementation is huge as well, which is I'm sure something that Matt and his colleagues can help with.
I think that's spot on, and it's a good transition to start talking about what is the candidate experience and what's the actual employee experience for someone who's just as involved as part of your organization. Part of the reason why I want to talk about this is because I think a lot of times when you're outside of a large organization, there's a tone that is set at the top, and the hope is that that tone gets all the way down through the crevices, the cracks, all the way throughout your organization. The reality is, and I'll just talk about it from a manufacturer's perspective, is that the CEO of the organization can come out and champion a cause. But in terms of who's the boss per se, and I hope Craig's not listening, but in terms of who's the boss, for the large majority of your workforce, it is the plant manager, it is the site HR lead, it is the shift coordinator.
Yep.
Craig, love him to death, is someone who they will never meet, someone who they're not really engaged in, and they can appreciate the overtures. But Pat, to your point, until it gets down all the way to where the employees and the candidates are, those decision makers are at that level, it's not a program that will sustain itself. So Matt, I want to come to you for a little bit. And with that kind of backdrop, and I know corporations are different in different spaces, but what would you say is one of the most important thing that corporations can do to make sure that when someone is hired, someone who's just as involved is already in your organization, how can we ensure that they advance their career?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, that training is so important. I would just echo what you both shared, which is, these decisions do get made at the highest levels, and then the implementers are, it's the plant manager in Strongsville, Ohio, that's charged with this, but it's also, the individual supervisors, the coworkers, like all the folks that are, engaged in this, that do have to be rowing in the same direction to make this work. So I think, some of it does come from leadership's ability to come in and rationalize why we feel like this is important as a company. Why is this important from a talent perspective? Why is this important from a community impact perspective? To elevate champions, people who, are willing to talk about perhaps their own experiences or the family's experiences with this, and be able to really have this conversation internally at a company. Because I think, the more that we can ensure that there's going to be, there may be pushback, but the pushback that comes, that we've done sort of the pre-work to educate folks. I think from a retention perspective, I think the first couple of weeks or couple of months are really important in this work. And I think, part of what companies can do to make sure that they're successful, I think one is just making sure that people who are implementing this work understand the collateral consequences of justice involvement, right? Understand, to some degree what it means to come out and to have some instabilities that may impact the workplace, right? So that could be unstable housing for a period of time. That could be disconnection from healthcare for a period of time. That could be, as was described earlier, a probation and parole officer who's telling you to meet once a week during work hours, who's perhaps doing a site visit and coming in and wanting to meet with your boss or your coworkers. And so making sure that the folks who are supervising individuals understand, here's what might be happening, and here's how we can approach that, or at least know what the community resources are to help folks work through those initial periods. And I guess I would come back to the community partner as a key piece of that, because I don't think that we can expect large companies to become social workers or to have the kinds of skills that you might need to be effective reentry counselors or effective job coaches. I do think that we can expect those partnerships to be made where, that plant manager or that supervisor has a person to call to say, hey, we're going through a challenge, we're working through something, can we triangulate and support the person? And so I think it does come back to building those effective partnerships and empowering your local team to know what those resources are and how to connect to them.
And when you think about wraparound services, and that's kind of the term of art in this space, what would you say are the most important? If you were going to design a fair chance hiring program for a company, what would you say, if you don't support anything else, make sure you have an external partnership that assists with providing these, let's call them top 2 or 3 wraparound services?
Yeah, so I'd be remiss in saying this is important for a lot of people working in a lot of jobs, right? So I think one of the conversations we often have with companies is, how do we be supportive of people who are dealing with, with reentry, but there's a lot of, people dealing with issues related to poverty that are addressing the same things. And so I think, companies do have to figure out, what is our holistic approach to making sure that people who may have some instability in their lives that affect their workplace, how are we approaching that and how are we dealing with it? But to answer your question, I mean, I do think, sort of housing and figuring out kind of all of this, I'll call them scheduling conflicts, but all of the real challenges of just getting back from a period of incarceration back into the community, that takes a lot. I mean, that's in some cases a full-time job just to figure out, how do we reconnect to all of the things, family, housing, healthcare, all of those things. And then I think supervision is the other one, just because it does come up a lot, and I think it's something that companies are often a little bit afraid of. because it means, hey, someone might be coming on site, someone might be calling out this person who we've been very purposeful about not sharing their conviction, that they have a conviction. And so I think, just making sure that community partners are supportive in those two areas of supervision and kind of reconnecting to life and services.
Carrie, I'm going to come to you for this next question. We heard in an earlier panel about just kind of the dehumanizing process that candidates can feel when they're going through the application process. Almost the one woman basically, it was kind of heartbreaking to hear her say, kind of expecting to get let down even after you go through it. And so I want to mirror some concepts. So Pat was talking about banning the box and kind of modifying your procedures to be EEOC compliant. But from your perspective, and how do you at PayPal, how are you humanizing the process, meeting your legal requirements, doing, making those individualized assessments, but how do you think about humanizing that hiring process?
Yeah, so I think the best way for me to answer this question is to share a recent experience. And so we were hiring our first apprentice cohort, as I mentioned, and it was a little bit of a struggle for us in a given day to get an offer letter out the door for a variety of reasons. And so one of our apprentices that we had extended a verbal offer to, so she knew she was getting an offer, but we could not produce a written letter on that given day, which happens. This is kind of normal sometimes, right? These things happen. This individual was very stressed, and so she started to talk to my recruiter, and ultimately we learned that she had a competing offer and that the deadline to make a decision was that day. Now, that competing offer, I don't think she was as excited about it, and it was paying much less. And so she kind of said this to my recruiter, and my recruiter called me up, and I said, you have to drop your script right now. You have to counsel her. You have to work with her as an individual and share with her and guide her that she needs to speak to the other employer and give her the language, because she certainly didn't feel empowered to do that. She didn't have the confidence. I think, quite honestly, she felt lucky that she got a job. Not that she was skilled enough to get the job. She was lucky to get it. And so my recruiter called her back and said, hey, look, you need to call this other organization if you really want to have some time. Here's a script. Let's role play it. And they spent an hour talking back and forth about how she could approach the situation in a way that we were guiding her, but that felt comfortable for her. And so she got off the phone, she made the phone call, she called back, she was exhilarated. She said, they gave me another day. And we knew we only needed a day. She just wanted to see this other letter. So she got the extra time, she felt great, and we are thrilled because she's joining us. But it wasn't a self-serving mechanism. It was more that we wanted her to have the opportunity to make the best choice possible for her and empower her to make that decision. So I think that's an example of just humanizing the process and working with people as people, and sometimes putting these corporate policies aside and just saying, I hear what you're saying. I'm actually really skilled in this. Let me guide you.
Makes a ton of sense. And Pat, how are you advising your clients when there are specific rules they need to follow, particularly when it comes to getting the background check and they're getting this document, looking at it? But how can they be better at assessing the individual and not just focusing on the background check piece of it? What advice are you giving them?
So a lot of the things that we are, like I mentioned previously, the EEOC, and they call them the green factors, but it's job related and consistent with business necessity. And so, talking about the role, talking about the candidate, talking about whatever factors might mitigate against a bar to employment. But really, we spend a lot of time going back and forth with our client, who's the hiring person, whether that's an HR or the hiring manager, getting them to really understand, should this conviction serve as a bar to employment, and really trying to look at that individual as, to your point, a human being. That said, we also have to drive consistency. So, a lot of it is, how have we treated others in the past? How do we intend to treat others in the future? Are there any special rules for with this particular position? Are they in a different jurisdiction? What industry you're in? Like I mentioned before, financial services, insurance, healthcare, education. All these industries have different rules based on different regulations, and so it really does get fairly involved. And there's a pretty robust back and forth when these background checks come up. But our goal is to work with the client and advise them and manage the risk, and then hopefully, and then to your point, also the FCRA and other laws like it require very strict compliance with how the process goes. So a lot of what I was talking about is the substance in terms of what is the conviction, what is the potential bar, what does the job look like, and then also, but the process has to be followed pretty strictly because there are statutory penalties involved with that as well. So it's definitely is a back and forth, and ultimately it's getting the employer comfortable or not. I mean, in some instances, we have to revoke the conditional offer based on one reason or another. But it's at least spending the time to do that diligence, documenting that diligence, so that if you're ever questioned about it later on, you can prove that you went through that process and really did consider all these other factors that should be weighed when making those decisions.
A lot of sense. I think the one thing, just one quick follow-up on that, one of the things that they are required to do is to give the candidate notice of a potential adverse
Right.
action. And oftentimes in those letters, what they will invite the candidate to do is to dispute the accuracy of a background check.
Mm-hmm.
Now, here's the problem with that, is that the background checks, there's a lot of information that is left off. And while a particular conviction may be accurate, the context is
Right.
nowhere on that document. And so I'm just curious, and I'll just open this, I won't put you in the hot seat too long, but I'm just curious from the rest of the team here, how are you working with your organizations to make sure that, yes, we're going to comply with what the law requires, but we're going to at least invite our candidates to give context to the extent they feel comfortable?
I can jump in there. So one piece of data I would love to see for the research community in the room is that the question of when those letters go out, right? Somebody gets an offer, or a conditional offer, a conviction comes up, the conviction has some concern, the letter goes out to the candidate to say, dispute, give us context. What's the likelihood that that candidate gets back versus moving on to the next employer? I think in a traditional environment where it's a letter rather than some of the outreach you discussed, it's quite low, would be my guess. And so I think for the employers that really want to put individual assessment into their process and say, we are moving away from red lights and green lights, right, into a place where we're looking at humans applying for a job, then you really have to put some thought into what does that individual assessment look like, right? How is the candidate receiving that? Because if somebody calls me and says, we think you're an amazing candidate for this job, this thing came up, we'd love to just invite you in or invite you to a conversation with folks to just talk about the context of the conviction, talk about what you've been doing since, just give us a sense so we can make a holistic decision. And I think that has to happen proactively in order for it to be meaningful, I'd say is piece one. I'd say the second piece is a lot of the folks ultimately tasked with making the decisions on the individual assessments may not be super empowered to say yes, right? May not have a lot of incentive to say yes and may not be in a position where they feel like they have the framework on how do we get to a yes. And so I think for companies that are building these individual assessment processes, to be able to say, what do we need to hear in order to say yes, and give perhaps a junior HR person who's tasked with that a framework to say, here's some questions to ask, here's how to work through the process, and ultimately there's a way in which we can hear what we need to hear to have the candidate's experience, the candidate's qualifications trump the conviction that we see.
Well, I think I think it's also the push and the pull between taking the time and investing the resources, and that's where it has to start at the top, but the training has to spread throughout the organization. Because the easy thing to do is click in your HRIS system, and then it's going to auto-generate the notices that need to go out, and you know what I mean. All those statutory things are going to be complied with, but you haven't taken that step back to really think about whether or not this particular issue should bar this candidate from working for you. So it really is just a matter of if the organization is going to take the time and put that effort in, because like I said before, the easy answer is, just click the box. And to your point, is there an incentive? Are you empowering those people who are on the front lines making those decisions and training them appropriately, both in terms of complying with the law, but also being consistent with whatever the overarching, philosophy behind the company is?
Yeah, and in full transparency for us, and that anecdote that I just shared, that was why the offer letter was delayed, because we were working outside the system and it was a manual process because we needed to discuss it and we needed to make sure that it wasn't going through the normal protocols. And so that does cause a delay. So yes, I think, but these are things that, we thought through up front, and I think that's part of the decision is you can't just decide to go into this. You have to think about every stage of the process and understand where are the bottlenecks, what do you need to do to resolve those ahead of time. So on the other side, you've got a person.
Right, makes tons of sense. As we wrap here, and I want to be respectful of time, Matt, I'd like you to have the last word on this. For all of the companies that you've worked with and partnered with, I would assume because it's corporate America, they want instantaneous results. But if you can just share a few words on what does a realistic time horizon look like? And ultimately, what does success look like if you're implementing these strategies?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's maybe a few answers to that. I think in terms of creating and implementing pilot programs and creating these hopefully deep, meaningful relationships with community organizations, I do think you've got to put in the several months of time to find the right organization, to build the partnership, to create the kind of trust to ultimately build that, to get to a place where they are successfully referring candidates in, you're hiring those candidates, hopefully those candidates are successful. The only caveat I'd say is there's some low-hanging fruit that can be done pretty quickly. So, Patrick started with ban the box. There are actions that you can take, like banning the box, like how you look at arrest records versus conviction records, where if you just make some sort of black and white decisions as a company that we're going to do this differently, you can see some pretty overnight effects. And I'll just share one quick anecdote, which is we worked with a company for several years, but really, the first thing that they did was ban the box and sort of change their hiring matrix a bit. And they were kind enough to share the data with us, which is sometimes challenging. But what they saw after a year was a disqualification rate that went from 20%, so 1 in 5 candidates were being dinged for their conviction, to 8% in a year. And that's sort of 1 or 2 fundamental policy changes that they've made. So I think to do the long game, you have to put in the time, and you have to build these relationships, and hopefully you create kind of a network of great partners. But I would say there's some upfront changes employers can make quickly.
Wonderful. Carrie, Matt, Pat, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Please give them a round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you.